Thank you so much, Louise, for that very glowing introduction. I hope my presentation can live up to it, all those adjectives. And thank all of you for coming, even though the debate was on tonight, if that was keeping some people away. I want to just focus on a part of this book. It's a somewhat long book and goes through all of Freud's life and attempts to bring him to life as a full-fledged human being with flaws and virtues, hence the title, Darkness in the Midst of Vision, that he has both a visionary side, which is quite extraordinary, and his ideas and theories, many of them have been enormously influential on 20th century thought. Many of you probably don't even know it, but you take for granted Freudian ideas about the unconscious, Freudian slips, ideas about stages of child development, the influence of early experiences on later personality, dreams and their meaning, and so on. At the same time, what I have come to feel about Freud from doing the research on this biography is that he was a deeply flawed person, and that his flaws or blind spots got built into his theories and his ways of understanding human personality and his method of psychotherapy in ways that have caused a good deal of damage to people. So it's a very mixed picture of darkness and vision. Let's start with a slide. This is the Freud, probably, that many of you are familiar with. The picture taken in his mid-60s with the famous cigar and neatly tailored suit and beard, and the penetrating gaze. Many people who knew Freud commented on his eyes, on his gaze, which they felt could peer into the depths of their soul. What is interesting to me is that Freud really worked hard to cultivate this look. Not exactly quite an act, but he wasn't born with it. Two of the mentors that were most important to him in his early adult years, his physiology professor Ernst Brucker and Jean-Martin Charcot, a famous neurologist and hypnotist that he studied with in Paris when Freud was in his late 20s, both were famous for their look. Brucker's eyes could strike terror into the hearts of his unprepared students, and Charcot, of course, was a hypnotist who put people into and out of trances with his eyes. And Freud, I think, took this on. And the point of this is not so much just about cultivating the magical look, but that Freud really set out as a young man to create a myth about himself, to obscure certain of the facts of his own childhood and his family background, and to portray himself as one of these mythological heroes who arises out of the mists and creates great deeds. I'm going to, in most of the talk tonight, explore both some of the myth and what the real childhood of Sigmund Freud was like. First, just a very brief summary of what I consider his lasting contributions and how important they were. First is the idea of the unconscious. Every one of these ideas does not originate with Freud himself. There were people around long before him talking about the unconscious and all of the other ideas I will cite. But Freud had a way of taking these ideas up, relating them together in a single system, providing a common vocabulary or language for them that was extremely compelling, so that when we talk about the unconscious today, we think first of Freud. One idea. The next is dreams, the idea of dreams and dream interpretation, that dreams are not just random thoughts passing through your mind, but that they are symbolic, meaningful representations of the important events in your life, and a method of interpreting dreams, which he spells out in the book that he always considered to be his most important, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. Third, I would cite his theory of child development. as I would rephrase it, the idea that the emotional events of the early years between the child and his parents and his siblings are enormously important in shaping the direction of all your later personality and your relations with other people. Now, Freud's specific version of this, that we pass through a stage of orality, anality, and an Oedipus complex and so on, I think by now have been shown to be largely erroneous. But the general idea of the emotional experiences of early childhood and their tremendous importance can be traced to him. And finally, psychoanalysis as a form of therapy. Again, the form that Freud specifically developed, classical or orthodox psychoanalysis, you know, the image of the patient lying on the couch with the analyst sitting behind, usually with a beard and a notepad, saying almost nothing, that you all may know from Woody Allen movies and other sources. That kind of analysis, I think, is passé, I hope is passé. There is now a variety of forms of contemporary psychotherapy and psychoanalyses that depart markedly from the kind of therapy that Freud practiced and advocated. At the same time, all of us who practice psychotherapy owe a debt to Freud because we all start with the method that he developed first. So these are what I would see as his lasting contributions, and they are quite significant. This is the visionary part. Now, to turn to the darkness, there are, I would, again, by way of summary, cite three major areas of terrible blindness in Freud's own work. One is the area of trauma, whether it's the childhood trauma of losing one's parent, or abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse, or trauma suffered by adults such as soldiers in war or what have you. Freud, as I will try and delineate in a moment, could not look at his own deepest childhood traumas, and because of this, he had to downplay, if not obliterate, the role of trauma in the lives of his patients and in his theories. So that's a terrible blind spot that I think has done a great deal of damage over the years. Second are his ideas about women. These have been criticized by a great number of authors in the last years, actually beginning as early as 1926 with a paper that Karen Horney wrote, one of Freud's early followers, and continuing to the present time. He thought women were morally inferior, more prey to their instincts, and that at the core of every woman's psychology was what he called penis envy, the wish to be a man, and that if a woman didn't recognize this and renounce it, she was doomed to be neurotic forever. There was never any very good evidence for these ideas. I think they arose from Freud's own background, his experience primarily with his mother and his sisters, the women in his childhood. But he inflates these ideas into principles which were then applied to many women and to patients, and I don't know if people in the audience now are aware, but there was a time, certainly in this country in the 1950s into the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s, where women were given to believe that there was something deficient about them if they wanted careers, or if they were ambitious, or if they didn't have, quotes, vaginal orgasms, and a number of other silly ideas that had their origins with him. So that's the second major area of darkness. And third is this his tendency to try and promote ideas into universal laws. When he discovered something, and usually he discovered it in himself, he immediately said, this applies to everyone. I was talking to a very talented research psychologist in Minnesota, Minneapolis, University of Minnesota, recently on a trip, who's done some of the finest work on child development, a longitudinal study following infants for 25 years until young adulthood. And he knows Freud's and Freud's ideas, and he says, where does he get this stuff? It seems like he wakes up in the morning and it's in his head and he decides it's a universal law. And in a certain sense, some of the things did have their origins in that way. So that ignores the complexity of human development. It ignores the individuality of different families, different people. It ignores different historical periods, different cultures, different socioeconomic conditions. All of that means nothing if you take Freud's ideas literally. Everybody is governed by these same drives and these same principles. Where does all this come from? Let me now go back into Freud's own childhood and try and sketch a picture of what he actually experienced and what happened to him and how he dealt with it and how that led to some of these blind spots within psychoanalysis. Now, if you look up at the top, this is Freiberg. I can't quite read it. I think it says 1856 to 1859, 1860. Freud was born in 1856 in this little town of Freiberg, which was about 150 miles north of Vienna, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As you look across at the top, you'll see Jacob Freud, his father, and Amalia Nathanson Freud, his mother. The father is 20 years older than the mother, had been married twice before to a woman named Sally Canner and then a woman named Rebecca. From that first marriage, Jacob had two sons, Emmanuel and Philip, and if you look at their birth dates, you'll see they're just very close in age to the age of his third wife. Emmanuel himself was married to a woman named Marie and had two children, John and Pauline, and again, if you look at their birth dates, they're very close to the birth date of Sigmund. These were his first playmates. This was a kind of extended family that Freud was born into in this little town. Jacob was a wool merchant. Only about 3% of the population of Freiberg was Jewish. The rest there were a few Protestants, but the large majority of them were Czech Catholics. So they were a tiny minority existing in this place, and I think for that reason, much more turned in on themselves as a kind of extended family. They all worked together in the family business, which was a kind of a middleman wholesaling business. They would buy wool woven by the peasants and store it in a warehouse, and then Jacob would be a kind of traveling salesman selling it to manufacturers. Now so Sigmund is the firstborn child to Jacob and Amalia. Jacob is about 41 and Amalia 21 when he's born. Within about a year, she gives birth to a second child, Julius, a boy, and this baby dies about 6 or 8 months later, so that before he's 2 years old, Sigmund loses his mother's care to a new baby, in and of itself not a terrible traumatic event. Then I think loses her to the grief she must have felt when her 6-month-old baby, second baby, died. Within a short period thereafter, she's already pregnant when Julius dies. She has still another baby, Anna, Freud's first sister, a woman, by the way, who he never liked. And then if you look on the bottom row and look at the dates, you'll see that 4 more sisters are born, Bing, 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 and then a son, Alexander, so that by the time Sigmund is 10 years old, his mother has gone through 7 pregnancies, and there are 6 younger siblings. The family lives, by the way, in Freiberg in a one-room apartment, so that the only children born in Freiberg were Julius and Anna, but all this takes place before the eyes of this young child. The main point, I think, being that he loses his mother's care again and again and again throughout his childhood to all these other little babies, the first 5 of whom are girls, and I think that has a powerful shaping influence on his later theories about what women are like. That is, that they're infantile and can't control their impulses, as he later puts it. If you look right up in the middle, you see the name of Monika Zajic, a nurse or maid. She's a woman, local Czech Catholic woman, who took care of the young Sigmund and who he has memories of and who was an important mother figure to him. Perhaps even a more important mother figure than Amalia, his own mother, who would have been taken up with these pregnancies and new babies and the death of Julius. And when he's 2.5, just about the time that his sister Anna is born, the nurse is caught stealing money from the family by his half-brother Philip, arrested, put in jail, and she vanishes from his life, and he never sees her again. So there is still another traumatic loss of a mother figure around the age of 2.5. When he's 3.5, his father's business goes bust, becomes bankrupt. The family has to move from Freiburg. Jacob, Amalia, Sigmund, and Anna, who are the only 2 children at that time, leave. He's about 3.5. They go to Leipzig, Germany for a year, and then to Vienna, where they settle permanently and where these next 5 children are born. At that time, the 2 half-brothers and their families, Emmanuel, Philip, Marie, and so on, the members of the extended family, go to England. So he loses them as well. He loses this sort of familiar extended family group. He loses the only home he's known. He loses his familiar surroundings. He's already lost his mother's care. He's lost his nurse who took care of him. All of these, I think, taken together and then reinforced by the events of the next years as he's growing up in Vienna, of losing his mother again and again to one after another new baby, constitute what I would call the primary trauma of Freud's earliest years. It is a trauma of loss of his mother, of her care, of his nursemaid, and so on. I'm going to quote you a little bit of evidence to support this. We know a good deal about this from Freud's self-analysis, which is something he undertook in his late 30s, early 40s, in correspondence with a Berlin nose and throat doctor named Wilhelm Fliess, who's a kind of a nutty guy that Freud was very attached to and very involved with, and who served as his kind of sounding board for the self-analysis. And the complete letters of Freud to Fliess have been published in 1885, and it is in these letters that one sees him going back to these early years as he can remember some of these events, and using his own dreams as a guide to get back to them. And I'm going to read you just a couple of things that he says about the nurse and about his mother, and what I would call the invention of the Oedipus complex, his first and one of his most important so-called universal laws. In 1897, when he's in the midst of trying to recapture his childhood, he writes to Fliess that the old nurse, quotes, told me a great deal about God Almighty and hell and instilled in me a high opinion of my own capacities. She was a Catholic and would take him to church and tell him about God, the Catholic God and hell. His mother later told him that he would come home from church with the nurse and tell the family wie Gott macht, how God carried on. That is, this little boy saw the Catholic priest up there performing the rituals and thought that was God, and he would imitate the rituals. And here, I think, is the most significant part of this memory that he recovers. This is Freud's own words. I shall be grateful to the memory of the old woman, the nurse. By the way, she was about 41. That doesn't seem too old to me at this point. I shall be grateful to the memory of the old woman who provided me at such an early age with the means for living and going on living. As you see, the old liking is breaking through again today. Now, I think that's an enormously important recovered memory. One is the means for living and going on living. He's in this family where a baby has just died. He's frightened of loss and of death, and somehow the nurse instills in him a feeling of that he can live. And he has a direct memory of his old love for her. The old liking is breaking through again today. And then, as I mentioned before, she's caught stealing, sent to prison, vanishes from his life, never sees her again. There's never any mention of her again in all of his voluminous writings, except in these letters to Fleece that he wrote in his during the time of his self-analysis. Now, this is what he says about his mother. Oh, let me precede that with another important event, and that is the origins of his phobia of traveling by train, something that troubled him for a number of years, and that was at its height during the time of his self-analysis. This was not some minor thing. Freud suffered, I think, during these years, and in many ways for a long time thereafter, from quite serious symptoms of anxiety and depression, and a kind of agitated, anxious depression, which he treated in a variety of ways, partly by trying to analyze himself, come to understand it, also by using cocaine, which he was involved with for about 15 years, although he never became the kind of addict where it took over his life entirely, but he certainly used it a great deal. And as everybody knows who's ever seen a picture of Freud with his cigars, by smoking. He smoked about 20 cigars a day. One assumes he inhaled, and so that he had a very powerful addiction to nicotine and could not live without it. Much later, when he got cancer of the mouth and his doctors would tell him, you know, you really ought to stop smoking, it's just irritating and making the cancer worse, he'd try to stop for brief periods of time, but he could not do it. He needed that nicotine. I think he needs it, kind of going back to these early losses and this kind of anxiety, he needs it to treat himself. It's his kind of tranquilizer. This is what he says about the origins of his travel phobia, which began at age 3.5 when the family first left Freiburg after the father's business collapse. This is a quote from Ernest Jones, Freud's one of his major biographers. On the way to Leipzig, Freud saw gas jets for the first time. This was at the train station before the days of electricity when gas was used for illumination. And they made him think of souls burning in hell. Interesting reference to the old nurse who took him to the Catholic Church and told him about heaven and hell. From this journey also dated the beginning of a phobia of traveling by train, from which he suffered a good deal for about a dozen years. And in fact, it never completely disappeared, and had something to do with his the reactions he had when he traveled to America in 1909 and the difficulty he had leaving Vienna in 1938 when the Nazis took over. He just was afraid to travel. What was his fear? What was this phobia? In his own terms, if it really was related to his Oedipus complex, which I'll talk about in a minute, one might have imagined that he would be frightened of the powerful locomotives, or think something would happen to him or cut him up or he'd be injured. But in fact, it was nothing like that. What his phobia was that the train would leave without him, that he would be left behind. In other words, that he would lose his parents, the people that he most needed. And for the rest of his life, really, even after he became the great and powerful and famous Freud, he'd always have to get to the train station if he was taking a trip way ahead of time because of this fear that he might be left or lose those he needed. In this self-analysis, he gets so close to discovering the origins of his own anxiety and symptoms. He remembers the old nurse. He recaptures the connection to the travel phobia and many other things. But it really is too much for him to bear. The anxiety is too intense, as I think it would be for anyone in a self-analysis when he's trying to do it all on his own, because the problem is about not having the needed other person, someone to love you, care for you, support you. And how can you do that when you don't have at least a therapist there to help you? So at a crucial point in the self-analysis, he turns away from all of this real trauma, all these losses, and thinks he's invented something else which explains it all. And here he is again in his own words, writing to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, "A single idea of general value dawned on me. I have found in my own case, too, the phenomena of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and I now consider it a universal event in early childhood." And this is what he says about it, the only memories he can recover. He says, quotes, "Later, my libido toward Matrum was awakened, namely on the occasion of a journey with her from Leipzig to Vienna, during which we must have spent the night together, and there must have been an opportunity of seeing her nudum. You yourself have seen my travel anxiety at its height." Now, there's a couple of interesting things about that quotation. First of all, he can't say mother and nude. He's got to put it in Latin and say matrum and nudum, sort of putting some distance between himself and the events. But the most important part to me is this isn't a memory. When he remembers the old nurse, he says, "As you can see, the old liking is breaking through again today." He feels his love for this nurse that he's lost. When he says about his mother is, "We must have spent the night together and there must have been an opportunity for seeing her." It's a reconstruction, it's a guess. It's not something that he directly experiences. But he thinks at this point that he has discovered this great universal law, the Oedipus complex, that every boy is sexually aroused, attracted to his mother, and this brings him into conflict with his powerful king-like father, and he has to give way to the father's power, and that this fear of the father, what he later calls castration anxiety, is at the root of everybody's anxiety, and he promotes this into a universal law. This does, I think, two interrelated things for Freud at this crucial point in his self-analysis, which I see as really the kind of turning point for him personally and for what later becomes psychoanalysis as a theory and a method of treatment. First of all, it reconfigures the actual events of his childhood. Instead of feeling himself to be this helpless, abandoned little baby boy, which is what he was in fact when he lost all these people that he needed, he reimagines himself as this little warrior figure filled with sexual and aggressive urges, at war with his king-like father. A very much less threatening way to feel about yourself. And second, as a man, as an adult, when he's doing all this, he thinks he's discovered a universal principle and that this is going to make him a powerful scientist. In the 19th century, one of the ways to be famous and great was to discover wide-sweeping scientific principles like Darwin's principles of evolution or Newton's laws of motion. And the Fliess letters, Freud and Fliess are constantly writing back and forth to each other. You, Fliess, are going to be the next Kepler of biology. I, Freud, am going to be the next Newton of psychology. They're imagining how their discoveries are going to make them powerful and famous, and very strong drive in him, and I think really, in a lot of ways, motivated to overcome a very opposite set of feelings that he struggled with, feelings of smallness, weakness, helplessness. His father, as I think I've mentioned, once he lost his business, never got back on his feet financially, could never support the family. They lived in close to poverty for most of Sigmund's life throughout the time he was in medical school. His father was hardly a powerful king-like figure. He wished he were, but in fact he was much the opposite. This is a picture of Sigmund with his mother Amalia when he's about 7 or 8 years old with two of his sisters. I wouldn't want to make too much out of the grim expressions on their faces, since I think you had to sit still for several minutes when you had your picture taken in those days, so they had to probably sit in these frozen positions. I want to give you one piece of evidence in support of the interpretation of Freud's life that I have been outlining here. This is a dream that he remembered from about just this age, when he's about 7 or 8, that he reports in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. In the dream, which was a very vivid one, I'm quoting Freud now, I saw my beloved mother with a peculiarly peaceful, sleeping expression on her face, being carried into the room by 2 or 3 people with birds' beaks and laid upon the bed. I awoke in tears and screaming and interrupted my parents' sleep. So it's a terrible nightmare, almost a night terror that this little boy has about seeing his mother dead. I fancy that the figures must have been gods from falcons' heads from an ancient Egyptian picture. The expression on my mother's features in the dream was copied from the view I had had of my grandfather, this is mother's mother, a few days before his death as he lay snoring in a coma. The interpretation carried out in the dream must therefore have been that my mother was dying. The funeral picture fitted in with this. I awoke in anxiety, which did not cease until I had woken my parents up. I remember that I suddenly grew calm when I saw my mother's face, as though I needed to be reassured that she was not dead. Now, that seems to be perfectly straightforward. By the way, his mother had tuberculosis during some of these years of his childhood and was often absent from the home, going to spas for recovery, and tuberculosis was the terrible scourge of the 19th century. It killed many people, and there were a great number of families that had lost at least one member to this disease. So the fact that as a young boy his mother had TB would heighten his feeling that he was going to lose her. So here's this dream. His anxiety about losing his mother continues as a young boy, but here's what he does with it. As though I needed to be reassured that she was not dead, he continues, quoting Freud, but this secondary interpretation of the dream had already been made under the influence of the anxiety that had developed. I was not anxious because I had dreamt that my mother was dying, but I interpreted the dream in that sense in my preconscious revision of it because I was already under the influence of the anxiety, which can be traced back when repression is taken into account to an obscure and evidently sexual craving that had found appropriate expression in the visual content of the dream. If you can follow that line of reasoning, you're doing better than I, and I've read it over many times. Essentially, what he's saying is, I'm not afraid because I've lost my mother or that I'm going to lose her because she's dying. It has something to do with some sexual feeling for her, which is all disguised and convoluted and this and that. That's Freud substituting an Oedipal sexual interpretation for what was in fact his primary trauma, fear of loss. And he's then stuck with this once he solidifies it in his self-analysis. And I think we can turn the slides off and get the lights on. Once he solidifies this as a cornerstone of his theory, he holds on to it forever. But there are a lot of different kinds of fathers, and Freud's major problem with his father was that he was quite the opposite of a powerful king-like figure, that he was a weak, kindly, but failed man who could not make a living to support his family. The family's poverty all those years were due to the father's failures. He could not take him as a model, and very early in his life, he turned to figures from his reading, particularly military heroes. Napoleon, who was a great figure for many boys in the 19th century, Alexander the Great. You remember that the slide of the family tree, the last child born was named Alexander after all those baby sisters. The family had held a council, Sigmund was 10 years old at the time, to decide what to name this new baby, and he made an argument that he should be named Alexander after Alexander the Great, and gave a long recitation of all of Alexander's military exploits, which he had memorized by the age of 10. So even then, he had already knew about and was identified with these heroic figures, particularly generals, particularly conquerors, Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Hannibal, who crossed the Alps to attack the Roman Empire, Oliver Cromwell in England, after whom Freud named his second son, and many others. And when he founded the psychoanalytic movement beginning in 1902, he models it on an army, with himself as the general, the commander-in-chief. He even refers to his followers as his lieutenants, and thinks of them as all surrounded by enemies that they have to go to war against. What's wrong with this? It's a singularly inappropriate model for a field that's supposed to be about therapy, about healing, about helping people that are in trouble. And nevertheless, Freud grafts this kind of military ideology onto psychoanalysis, where it has a very powerful influence for many years. I'll say just a couple of words about the First World War. By this time, 1914, psychoanalysis is quite well established, and Freud has a number of followers in different cities throughout Europe and America and England. The First World War was an incredible turning point in the thinking and lives of many intelligent people at the time. That before that there was a kind of belief in rationality and science and progress, and the idea that savagery and untrammeled aggression was something that occurred off in Africa or India or America, which the Europeans believed was a kind of savage country. But it couldn't happen here, couldn't happen in Europe, and yet the First World War really came out of the heart of what were thought to be the most civilized, advanced nations of Europe, Germany, France, England. And it was a barbaric, horrible event that went on for years and killed millions to no seeming purpose. Freud was initially quite enthusiastic about the war, in line with his military identifications. Came to be somewhat disillusioned, but never really changed his ideas about his idealization of generals and military heroes. The most important point, I think, to come out of it is that one of the results of the First World War was that enormous numbers of soldiers who fought in it, who didn't get killed, were traumatized, suffered from what we would today call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a term that didn't exist at that time. It was then called shell shock, or war neurosis, or combat neurosis. Shell shock was the most common term. The existing treatments before Freud and psychoanalysis were quite barbaric. The men who broke down in combat were thought to be cowards or deserters. Many of them were executed, or if they fell into the hands of doctors, the doctors would apply electric shock to them to kind of torture them into giving up their symptoms, and so they could be sent back to the front. Those physicians who did take up some of Freud's ideas and encouraged the soldiers to talk about the feelings and the events that were associated with their breakdown did much better. Some of you may know the trilogy of novels by Pat Barker, Resurrection, and others based on the work of W.H.R. Rivers, an anthropologist and physician in England, and there were others. They took up part of Freud's ideas. Freud himself, though, could never really get with the idea that the actual traumatic events of the war were responsible for the symptoms of these soldiers. And it was, again, a terrible failing, because many of the symptoms that they displayed were exactly like the symptoms of the patients, the women patients that he had treated in the 1890s, on whom he had first formulated his ideas about neuroses. paralyses and loss of sensation and the like. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. This is from our chapter on the traumas following the First World War. This is Freud in 1921, just a couple of years after the end of the war. Most of the neurotic diseases which have been brought about by the war disappeared on the cessation of the war conditions. They were gone. How did he know that? We now know it is absolutely untrue. He didn't see any of these poor guys. It fit with his theories. In his theories, the only kind of thing that could cause neurotic symptoms were the events of your childhood. If you broke down because of something that happened to you as an adult, it would go away as soon as you were out of there. Well, as we now know, it's quite the opposite is true. It doesn't matter how good your childhood is. If you're subjected to enough horrible stress, and certainly World War I was like that, you're going to break down. Everybody would. We counterpose that quote. I say we, by the way, because my wife Barbara was very intimately involved, particularly in writing these chapters on the First World War and the war neuroses. Counterpose that quote from Freud that says, the neuroses are all going to disappear as soon as the war is over, with a quote from an actual First World War veteran. The older I get, the sadder I feel about the uselessness of it all, but in particular, the deaths of my comrades. I thought I had managed all right, kept the awful things out of my mind, but now I'm an old man and they come back out from where I hid them every night. Trauma is extremely long-lasting, especially when it's not treated, and it can be trauma that you suffer as an adult. It didn't fit with Freud's theories, and Freud's theories had such a grip on psychiatry and medicine that it wasn't really until toward the end of the Vietnam War in the late 70s that these PTSD and the effects of adult trauma, war trauma, really got a legitimate hearing. So that goes back to one of the points I was making at the beginning when I talked about Freud's terrible blind spots, his attitudes toward women, the way he had to promote everything into universal laws, and I think one that's done almost more damage than any other, his need to de-emphasize or his blindness to the effects of trauma, whether it's the effects of trauma in childhood or adult trauma. I think that's a good place to stop, and we are now open for questions. Be happy to answer. We have 2 microphones, so if you have any questions, please step up to the microphone. An excellent question. After writing, I've been practicing psychotherapy and psychoanalysis for more years than I care to remember, but after writing this book, I come to wonder whether I should still call myself a psychoanalyst, because I've found myself differing in so many respects from Freud, and in the popular mind, for whatever reason, psychoanalysis seems so tied to him and the image of the classical analyst. In fact, there is a kind of contemporary modern psychoanalysis that many of us practice now that has very little in common with Freud's old kind of psychoanalysis. So call it contemporary psychoanalysis, or maybe we should change the name and call it something else. But it's not this, we don't de-emphasize trauma. We believe that real events are what are important in shaping people, whether in childhood or in adulthood. We don't think women are inferior. We don't think the analyst should be silent and only make interpretations on an intellectual level. It's very engaged and relational and the like. Some other, yes, sir. He made a good living. Yeah, it's a very good question. Again, I think you need to put it in the historical context. When Freud came along and began to publish these things in the late 1890s and the beginning of the century, there was almost nothing else available. If you're a doctor treating patients, whether you're a neurologist or just a general practitioner, and someone came into you with phobias or anxiety attacks or what we might now call eating disorders or terrible depressions, you had no way of understanding what this was and no way of treating it. So that what Freud offered was so much superior to what was around that many very intelligent people flocked to him, and psychoanalysis got going in that way. And because he was there first and had published the seminal works, he became a kind of cult-like figure. And he did indeed have a very flourishing practice and charged lots of money, and many of his followers were dependent on him for referrals. Wilhelm Steckel, one of his early followers, is quoted as saying something like, they were all fed at his trough. They were all dependent on him for their very livelihoods. So he did extremely well, and part of growing up so poor for so long is he had what might be called a poor man's neurosis, that he never, no matter how much money he made, he never thought that he had enough, and so he had to charge very high fees and insist that people pay them immediately. And after the war, when Vienna and Austria was plunged into a terrible kind of inflation in which their currency would become worthless over short periods of time, he had many American patients paying him in dollars, so he'd have a solid source of income. That doesn't answer the main point of your question. Let me get to that. Was he any good? Did his patients get better? A very mixed picture. One of the things I do in the book is try and review every single case of Freud's about which we have enough information to make some kind of a judgment. And my conclusion would be it is an extremely mixed picture, that there are patients who feel like they got an enormous amount from him, that he helped them tremendously at one extreme. There are patients who I think he damaged terribly, caused a great deal of harm to at the other, and then there's a sort of spread in between. What's the difference? If you're one of Freud's patients and you want to get something from him, you've got to comply with him. You've got to adore him. You've got to let him know that you think he's the great genius, and that anything that he tells you is, you're lucky to hear it. And of course, many of these people suffering from their symptoms, not having anywhere else to turn, really did feel this. That here was the great Freud actually spending hours listening carefully to them and trying to understand what was going on in their mind. And people who were able to comply in this way did get a great deal out of it. Often they would say, some of these people have written book-length accounts of their analyses with Freud, would say, just the fact that this great man was listening seriously to me meant more than anything else. It wasn't his interpretations. That's not what he would say, but that's what they would feel. If you were spunky, if you had a mind of your own, if you didn't agree, or if you felt that some of his interpretations didn't fit you, or in particular, if you were a young woman, he could be quite harsh with you, and he'd lay an interpretation on you about your penis envy, or you just got to accept the idea that you want to be a man like your brothers, and if you don't, you're doomed to neurosis. And if the woman would say, "Hey, I don't feel that," you're resisting, and he'd get quite hostile, and those people would have very damaging experiences. So there was a whole gamut. I would say, on balance, he's not a very good therapist. You do better to see somebody else. Yeah. Louise, that's a great question, Louise, because it enables me to make an additional point. Austria was a terribly anti-Semitic country, perhaps more so than Germany, which we, because of the Holocaust and the rise of the Nazis, we tend to think of as the kind of epitome of anti-Semitism. A long history of anti-Semitism. At the same time, Franz Joseph, who was the emperor of Austria during most of Freud's life up until the time of the First World War, was pro-Jewish and combated anti-Semitism. So it was a complicated, mixed picture. Many Jews who emigrated to Vienna in the second half of the 19th century found enormous opportunities there. Their children could be educated. They rose up in the professions and business. Many of them converted to Christianity. And 19th century anti-Semitism in Austria was viewed as a kind of religious anti-Semitism, not a racial anti-Semitism. So if you wanted to stop being a Jew, all you had to do was say, I'm not going to be a Jew anymore, I'm joining the Catholic Church, or I'm converting to Protestantism, and anti-Semitism didn't apply to you anymore. It was only in the 20th century, and the sort of the precursors to Nazism, that the Jews were defined as a race, so that it didn't matter whether you changed your religion. So that was the kind of context in which Freud lived. He was subjected to a certain amount of this, no doubt. When he went to the University of Vienna and when he went to medical school there, over half of the students in medical school were Jewish. By the time he was a practicing physician toward the end of the century, the heads of the major medical departments, the physician to the royal family, were all Jewish. So it wasn't exactly, holding you back so much to be a Jew. At the same time, he knew, as any Jew knew, that he was a member of a outgroup, a sort of despised minority. There were still lots of people who considered the Jews inferior. And I think it's again a point that my wife Barbara has brought to my attention very clearly. It was particularly important for him because of his poverty and the father's failure. If you're the son of a wealthy Jewish family, the fact that a bunch of Catholic workers and peasants don't like Jews is not going to affect you, because you're more powerful and wealthy than they are. But if you're the son of a poor, failed father, and you feel inferior and inadequate because of that, then the fact that anti-Semitism is around is going to fit in with that and hit you. Now, to come to your question, which I think again illustrates very powerfully this business about the invention of the Oedipal myth. The story is as follows. Freud reports it in The Interpretation of Dreams. He says he's walking with his father down the street one day in Vienna. He's about 11 or 12, and his father is telling him how much better things are now in Vienna than they were in the village where he grew up. And the father says, one day I, as a young man, was walking along the street, and a Gentile came up, knocked my hat into the gutter, and said, "Jew, get off the sidewalk." And little Sigmund says, "Daddy, what did you do?" And he says, "I went and picked up my hat. I didn't do anything." And then Freud, in recounting this, says, "This did not sit very well with me, and I decided from that moment on to take Hannibal, the great warrior who attacked the Roman Empire, as my model rather than my father." Now, let me contrast that with a parallel story about Oedipus. You go back and read Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex. Oedipus, there's a prophecy made that he's going to kill his father, Laius, the king of Thebes, when he's born, and so Laius puts him out on a hillside to be exposed and died, and he's picked up by a shepherd and taken to a neighboring kingdom where he's raised as the son of the king there, and doesn't know that Laius is his real father. And as a young man, then he's traveling back on the road, and Laius and his entourage, the king of Thebes, is coming along, and they say to him, "Oedipus, get out of the way, get off the road." And he steps aside, and when Laius goes by, he reaches out with his staff and whacks Oedipus with it. Oedipus thereupon picks up the carriage, overturns it, takes the staff away, beats Laius to death, and kills most of the members of the entourage. In other words, it's the exact opposite of the story about Freud and his father. And I think this is why Freud wants to imagine himself a little Oedipus, a little Hannibal, rather than a Jacob Freud, this kind of failed Jew who doesn't have any real power. Yeah, would you step to the microphone, please? Again, a very good question. In a certain way, there's nothing new under the sun. All kinds of ideas, have been around forever. You can show that find them in the Greeks or in Aristotle or in Leonardo's work and so forth, scientific ideas and the like, so that the ideas about the unconscious, about the importance of infantile experience, meaning of dreams, have been around. I don't think that can be used in and of itself to detract from Freud's accomplishment. Your question is, what did he do that leads us to think of all these ideas as Freudian? First and foremost, he was a masterful writer. I sometimes think of him as more a dramatist or a novelist than a scientist. He had a way of taking all these ideas and writing about them in a kind of compelling prose that captured people's attention, of giving a language to them, of giving names to them, the ego and the id and the superego, the pleasure principle and the reality principle, the death instinct. They're all very captivating terms. And second, he drew all these ideas together in what appeared to be a single encompassing system. Now, in fact, if you try and kind of treat it as a single scientific system in which everything is logically interrelated, it really doesn't hold up that way. But the appearance of the system is there, the common language is there, and I think that's what he did. There's a French psychotherapist named Pierre Genet who had a method of psychotherapy very much like Freud's, but he was not a writer that captured anybody's attention, and he kept voluminous notes on all of his patients that's quite boring to read. And so he's forgotten today, by and large, even though his method was very much like Freud's and came before him. So in a way, you can say he's kind of a salesman or somebody who could sell his ideas, present them in very compelling form. Yeah, please. He's a monomaniac and totally obsessed with becoming famous and getting his ideas across. And I think you're right. I think people who do make great and lasting contributions, have to be driven in this way. If you study the lives of lots of people, book I wrote right before this was a study of Dostoevsky, and just like Freud, Dostoevsky, when he's high school age and he's not written a single thing, he writes to his brother, "I'm going to be one of the world's greatest novelists." And by God, he's going to drive himself to do that. And it's that drive and that obsession and putting everything that you have into it that is important in getting there. So that's certainly true. And Freud's not to be faulted for that. It probably is what, in part, accounts for his enormous influence. I'm not sure exactly what you were saying, the other point, but I think it's a variation of what I'm saying about him being more like a novelist or a dramatist, that there's something enormously compelling about his writing. Let me make a point that I haven't made before tonight, which I think maybe relates to what you were saying, and that is, when Freud stops his so-called self-analysis in the 1890s, he says he's finished, he's solved his neurosis. In fact, I think all of his writings for the rest of his life are a continuation of his self-analysis, just as the writings of a great novelist kind of come out of their own unconscious and their own experience. They're observations of other people, what they take in around them, but in some way fueled by their inner sources. And this is true of Freud. I've come to feel the more abstract his stuff seems to be. He may be writing about theories that seem to have nothing to do with people, that have to do with the forces of life and death, the eros and thanatos. In fact, I think he's writing dreams about himself. And it's because of this that his writings are like great literature, that there's a sort of surface story, and then there are levels of meaning underneath that come out from these personal sources that give some of the real richness to Freud's writing. So, a partial answer to a complicated question. Yeah? Okay, two more. Yeah, much more comfortable with men. The first point, four of his sisters died in 1942, if you saw that family tree. And that's no coincidence. They were all killed in Nazi concentration camps. In 1938, Freud was very slow to leave Vienna. Of course, he was quite old and sick with cancer at the time, but he was finally persuaded to leave, and he was able to get out his wife and his sister-in-law and his children and their families, servant, his dog, pet dog, his doctor, and the doctor's wife and his 2 children. But he left these 4 sisters, who were women in their 70s, left them behind in Vienna, and there's no way to know whether he really could have got them out, or the people that were helping to get him out could have got them out, or whether he didn't try to get them out. We just don't know. I don't think he liked these sisters, but that doesn't mean he left them behind to die. And in 1938, it was also not the case, it was the case that people didn't anticipate the full horror of the Holocaust. These were old women of no particular significance. They weren't rich, they weren't well known. I think a lot of people would feel that, they don't want to move, let them live out their quiet lives in their apartments, nobody's going to bother them. But in fact, of course, they were all killed in concentration camps. So that's the answer to that. The other question is much more complicated, the role of women in his life. He was married for many, many years. He had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. He lived outwardly this very conventional bourgeois life. Toward the end, there's a quote that I think is very significant. He writes to actually Lou André Salome, I think one of his women's supporters, speaking of his wife, he says, "She was not a bad solution to the marriage problem." Well, his most intense emotional attachments were to men throughout his life. This guy Fleece, that he was writing to during the time of the self-analysis, I think was the great love of his adult life. And when that relationship fell apart, I don't think he ever quite got over it, and he sort of vowed, I'm never going to fall in love again. I'm never going to do that again because it's too painful. He, in his own words, Freud talks about eruptions of unruly homosexual libido, that he did feel these kind of things toward men. And I think my interpretation of that is he was at the deepest level, it was like a little baby or a little kid longing for love, and it was safer to get it from his father than his mother. His mother I didn't talk much about, but she was a very aggressive, domineering, difficult woman, where his father was, well, a failure, a kind of easygoing, loving guy. So that all his life, Freud is turning to these men to try and get a kind of early love from them, more so than women. Now, one of the things that a lot of people have said is that how can you say, Freud's anti-women? He welcomed women into psychoanalysis. He had a number of women followers at a time when women, certainly in Vienna and Europe, were barred from some of the professions. Yes and no. He welcomed women if they were absolutely devoted and loyal to his ideas. That was the more important criteria for him. If they questioned his ideas, he turned on them viciously, just as he did any of his male followers. And when you look at the cases, again, someone had asked about how was he as a therapist. He's worse with young women than he is with men. You mentioned the Dora case. Dora is a young woman that he sees around 1899, and he's just ghastly with her. And when she doesn't agree with his interpretation, he's even more ghastly. There's a young homosexual woman that he sees and writes a case study about around 1920, 1921, much later when he's, presumably learned a great deal more. And he's just as bad with her. Turns on her, drives her away. So I think he has a real underlying core of antagonism toward women and is much more likely to seek love from men. One more question. You had a turn, but I don't see any others, so you get to go again. Freud's writings really, as I was mentioning, they're rich and multi-layered, and you can read them. Interpretation of Dreams is terribly long, but the case studies are interesting. A paper he wrote called Mourning and Melancholia is very interesting. These are ones that have really more modern ideas in them. A paper called Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety is very important. Beyond the Pleasure Principle, particularly the first part. There are any number of his writings that certainly are worth reading because they have so many layers in them. But my book is a kind of a guide also. Okay, thank you all very much for coming.